Welcome to Brainbox, a podcast for your noggin. Brainbox is a program of Oklahoma Humanities, a nonprofit organization that strengthens communities by helping Oklahomans learn about the human experience, understand new perspectives, and participate knowledgeably in civic life. You can check out all of our programs at okhumanities.org. I'm your host, Chris Carroll. In this episode, we're going to talk about the 1970s and American memory. Our guest is Dr. Ben Alpers, a professor of American intellectual and cultural history at the University of Oklahoma's Honors College. Ben is also a member of the Oklahoma Humanities Board of Trustees, and he's a great advocate for the importance of the humanities in our state and across the nation. Ben was the first guest on our very first episode of Brainbox in 2018, talking about Watergate. And we also did a great episode last year about the 1960s. So welcome back, Ben. We're so glad to have you again.
Delighted to be here.
So we are now somehow a half a century away from the start of the 1970s. So this is an interesting time to talk about some of the aspects of that decade. In our episode about the 60s, you talked about a concept that I've really enjoyed thinking about since then, the different possible definitions of the 60s, quote unquote, the 60s. Like you mentioned, there's a way of seeing a long 60s and a short 60s. And now that we're at the start of a new decade, I've been thinking about how will we define the 20s and the teens. I'm curious about the 70s. Do historians discuss different conceptions of the 70s? Is there a short 70s and a long 70s?
There is actually. And there's the shortest 70s. Well, let me start at the end. The 70s is a decade that has as I think for most historians, a peculiarly neat ending, because the election of Reagan in 1980 really seems like the beginning of what we associate with the 80s.
Perfect timing.
There's very little argument about when the 80s begins. So there is no 70s that bleeds into the 80s as there is a 50s, and we may talk about this, that bleeds into the early 60s. The beginning is a little more controversial, I guess you'd say. There's a short 70s that begins with Watergate. And so it sort of begins or begins with the end of Watergate. It begins with the Ford presidency that sort of sticks Nixon in the long 60s. I don't think that that's a very sensible view. And I don't think that's a very sensible view, both because I think the Nixon years are pretty fundamentally different from the 60s, even the late 60s, the Nixon years of the 70s. And there are a lot of sort of what I'd say, and we can talk about this, very 1970s things about the early 70s. And the other thing that I think is really important when thinking about when the 70s begin, is that if you look back at American media in January 1970, possibly because the 60s are already such a kind of thing in the American mind, that there's a profound sense that a new era is upon us. A lot of the 60s ends, right? 1968, famously kind of difficult year, lots of political violence, lots of change, the Tet Offensive, and so on. And 69, you have Woodstock, you have all these big cultural events. And Altamont happens, right? There's a sense that this is coming to an end. And so even in January 1970, a lot of people are sort of anticipatorily imagining that the 70s are going to be a different decade, talking about the 60s coming to an end. So I think that it's actually most useful to think of the 70s as starting in 1970. But if we're not going to start them in 1970, you have to at least include the oil shocks in there. You need to include Kent State in there. You need to include, if we're thinking about events that resonate today, the so-called Hard Hat Riot, which is very important politically in the early 1970s and which sort of plays into Nixon's re-election strategy in 1972, a moment where, the quote-unquote white working class seems like a constituency that suddenly the Republican Party can appeal to in the 1972 election. So all of those things seem not very 1960s to me. And so there are historians, I'm the wrong person to ask for an argument for this, who I guess because they think of Nixon as a figure from the 60s, elected in 1968, and of course ran in 1960 as well. I guess that somehow the Nixon presidency belongs to the 60s, also because Vietnam is so important to it. But from where I sit, the 70s really does begin in January 1970, if for no other reason that there's a kind of self-consciousness about that. which when things start happening in the 1970s, people are already thinking about them as being distinctly 1970s. That is, there's a kind of consciousness of what it is to be the 70s.
Do you think that's unique to this? Oh,
sorry.
Do you think that's unique to the 70s? Maybe do you think people at the beginning of the 60s or the 50s had a consciousness of this is a new era beginning? I mean, maybe with Kennedy.
I don't think it's unique. I think it intensifies. I mean, I think thinking in terms of decades and the significance of decades goes way back, right? Think about the Roaring '20s. Think about so Americans have been thinking that way in broad terms for much longer than that. But there's something about the intensity with which the 60s hits, I think, that make that moment in American life in the early 1970s, people sort of thinking in terms of decades, particularly intensive. As well as a sense, particularly I would say among a lot of major public intellectuals, that the 60s ends in a sort of curdled place. So if you think of someone like Joan Didion, who is, an important voice in these years, and her essay, Slouching Towards Bethlehem, which is sort of it's a kind of critical essay about the summer of love, and is one of the most important sort of, I guess you'd say, contemporary critiques of the 60s counterculture as the 60s counterculture is going on. She very much sees the Manson murders as the kind of end of the 60s, and then writes an essay called On the First Day of the 70s, written in January 1970.
Oh, wow.
Which is actually, interestingly enough, largely about looking back to the 1950s and her experience as a college student then, and sort of saying, what's changed? So a lot of this early thought about the 70s is almost like the sort of cultural equivalent of negative space. It's about the 60s being this big thing that is now over, and then what? Right? And we can talk more about this. There's been an explosion of interest in the 1970s, both in the culture, I think, and also in scholarship among historians. And what's happened really over the course of the last, I'd say, 20 years, maybe 25 years, is that historians have come to see the 70s as a much more crucial watershed, a much more crucial sort of moment in which what we now think of as contemporary America emerges from than the 60s were. And really, well into the 1980s, the 60s were seen as the great decade of change. There's the very first scholarly book by an American historian about the 1970s, which comes out in the very early 1980s, is titled "It Seems Like Nothing Happened." Which is, I mean, the title is meant ironically, but it reflects this strong sense, and I can talk a bit more about this, my own experience growing up in the 1970s, that the 70s were this kind of quiet letdown after the 1960s. There's so much sort of passion and vibrancy, hope, rage, disappointment, all these things in the 1960s. And what do you have in the 70s? You have stagflation, you have an oil shock. You just have things seemingly kind of quietly falling apart. And I think now we look back and see the 70s as sort of different, and things that go on in the 1970s maybe is more foundational in a lot of different ways of what America is today. So the 70s now seem very, very important. But I think at the time, it almost seemed as if it was the sort of quiet after the storm.
The hangover after the party in some ways.
Exactly.
Like I'm into music history, and I do think Altamont is such an interesting symbolic end of the 60s, where the optimism of Woodstock dies on the West Coast with a violent and ugly concert with the Rolling Stones and the Grateful Dead, where a fan is murdered basically right in front of the stage. What a symbolic end of an era there. I did want to ask, before we get further into the kind of historical aspects of the 70s, I'm curious about your, as you mentioned, kind of your own personal associations of the 70s, having lived through them. Like I was born in late 1972, and so I was a little kid during the 70s, and my overwhelming kind of sense of the 70s is like the color brown and earth tones and corduroy. Like all of our furniture and clothes had this sort of earth tone vibe to it. My mom listened to Barry Manilow and Neil Diamond. I'm curious, what are your kind of cultural touchstones of the 70s personally?
So I was born in 1965, and I grew up in Berkeley, California. And the overwhelming sense in Berkeley was of having missed this party.
Oh.
Right? That there was all this stuff, all of this ferment going on. And it was still sort of going on in the 1970s in a lot of ways. I mean, you know, radical politics, culture, and so on. So all happened. It's not like it's dead, but it did feel sort of curdled. I do remember growing up in a situation in which the possibility of sort of low-level political violence was always kind of there. You know, my earliest political memories are I think I have a vague memory of the RFK assassination.
Oh, wow.
But I remember Watergate quite well. I remember Watergate actually largely because it interrupted Sesame Street on PBS. And so like one of the few things I was allowed to watch under normal circumstances wasn't on TV anymore. And my parents were happy to have me watch the Watergate hearings. I don't think I really understood them. But they were on instead, right? And Nixon's resignation speech was one of the very few times that my family was, my parents like sat us down in front of the TV like, this is history, you have to watch this. Wow. The moon landing back in '69 was another one of those. So growing up in Berkeley, though, in the 1970s, again, was this deep sense that there was all of this positive and exciting stuff that had been going on that was now largely gone. And what was left was this kind of negative things like Patty Hearst being kidnapped, right? The SLA, all of that in the middle of the decade. Or the sort of drama over Jim Jones and the People's Temple in the late 70s, right?
Oh yeah.
And so all of that was kind of what was going on, as well as the sort of, you know, the new age stuff one thinks of in the 1970s. And that was like, not my parents, but my friends' parents were going through very 1970s midlife crises. So it was growing up with friends who have parents who were using a lot of drugs. I mean, the parents were using a lot of drugs, or who were like going down to Esalen for various kinds of consciousness raising retreats and stuff like that, right? So that whole world of the 70s was sort of happening around me. I was too young for it, but my parents' generation, sort of the younger end of my parents' generation, was sort of the perfect age for it. And it was not, I think, was not something that either I or my friends felt particularly sympathetic to. So again, I remember profoundly on New Year's Eve 1980 thinking, well, glad that's over. Not really knowing what the 80s were going to bring at all.
I definitely want to ask you later about some pop culture reminiscences of the 70s. Yeah. One of my favorite of which is probably Dazed and Confused, where the characters are like, the 70s are terrible, the 80s are gonna, the 60s rocked, the 70s were terrible, the 80s are gonna be awesome.
Yeah, it is exactly that. And I remember exactly that thought. And yeah, that captures that perfectly.
Well, you wrote a really fascinating piece for the Society for U.S. Intellectual History blog about the film American Graffiti. And I know that started you on a book project about the 1970s that we'll definitely talk about. Can you describe how this 1973 film about 1962 tells us a lot about America in the 1970s?
Yeah, no, it's a funny little movie, right? It's George Lucas, who we now, of course, associate overwhelmingly with Star Wars. And it's his first hit film. At the time he makes it, he is seen as almost like an almost art film director. His first film, THX 1138, is this rather odd science fiction movie, which is not very audience-friendly, I guess would be the way to describe it. And it doesn't find much of an audience. But the early 70s, and we can talk more about this, are a moment when Hollywood is throwing a lot of money at young filmmakers, in part because they're not quite sure how to make money anymore, and films like Easy Rider made huge amounts of money in the late 60s, and there's a certain sense that these young filmmakers might have what it takes, and it turns out they do. If we think about Spielberg and Jaws and Lucas and Star Wars a little later in the decade, that's where Hollywood kind of makes a huge comeback in the late 1970s.
And Coppola with The Godfather.
Yeah, and Coppola the Godfather. In fact, Coppola is key to getting funding for American Graffiti, because Coppola, who's about a contemporary of Lucas's, was a big believer in the project And Lucas didn't really have oomph yet in Hollywood. He'd gotten a lot of money actually for THX 1138 and hadn't made any money. And American Graffiti, I think, struck studios as a rather odd project. The name sounds like it's an Italian movie. I mean, like, American Graffiti, right? And it not only had a hard time getting made, but hard time getting much distribution. It becomes one of the big surprise hits of 1973. And what's interesting about it, right, as you say, is it is a nostalgia piece set 11 years ago, right? It's like if someone made a movie today set in 2009 about what an utterly different world 2009 was. And it's sold that way. The tagline for the film is "Where were you in '62?" And it finds an audience that way. And I should say, I remember it that way too. And I read a bit about this in the piece, right? I didn't see it when it came out in '73. I saw it as it played in sort of repertoire film theaters later in the decade. But it seemed like a film about the pretty distant past, long before my time, and about a place far away. And in fact, it takes place in a town that's about a 40-minute drive from where I live.
Oh,
and,
wow.
It's Modesto, which is nothing like Berkeley, but is, Northern California. Just 3 years before I was born. And to me, every aspect of that I found fascinating, both the way in which a time and a place that was close to me could seem so distant, and the way it could seem so distant to American audiences too. And the film is very much about that. It's a autobiographical piece on Lucas's part, and if you actually look at Lucas's whole filmography, it really stands out that way. He's not a filmmaker who made a lot of films about himself, right? Lucas was. It's about a bunch of high school seniors in Modesto in 62, the year that Lucas graduated from high school.
And he's from that area, right?
That's where he's from, and they're all racing cars, which is what Lucas's great passion in high school was car racing, was drag racing, and a crash. I don't think it's a crash he's in. I think it's a crash a friend is in. Convinces him to stop doing that and to go into movies instead. So this is really, in that sense, a very autobiographical movie from Lucas's perspective. It's about his absolute contemporaries in the town he grew up in, and so on. And the film is haunted by what's to come. And this is most captured, actually. The film is much copied in a lot of ways. And one of the things that's copied from it in films like Animal House actually copies this device. It ends with a kind of end title scroll, which tells you about what happens to all the characters in it. And the main characters are high school seniors. The female characters are sort of less important to the plot of the film. It's really focused on the boys who are trying to decide what to do with their lives, whether to go off to college, whether to stay in town, and so on. And then we have an end crawl at the end, which tells you what happens to all of these people in the future. And all of their lives turn out to be affected by Vietnam. One of them dies in Vietnam. One of them ends up in Canada. It doesn't say why he ends up in Canada, but if you hear that in the early 1970s, you know they're escaping the draft. That's why people from California would be in Canada. And so there's a way in which this whole world is about to go away. And of course, this is also before the Kennedy assassination. So this is before the 60s became the 60s, if you see it that way. And people now think of American Graffiti as a 50s film. Yeah. Right? Because it's the rock and roll soundtrack and so on. But it's absolutely not. It's the early 60s. But it's on the other side of, quote unquote, the 60s from 1973.
Maybe an example of the long 50s, how the late 50s and early 60s blended together.
Yeah, it's an example of the long 50s and by sort of contrast the short 60s. Because in 1973, people can look back and that seems like a very different world. And it's not the only example of this. The other great example of this is Grease, which is actually from earlier in the 1970s. It's a musical. Late 70s is the film. But Grease, which I think is also set in the very early 1960s. I think it's actually set in 60 or 61.
Yeah,
but
I think that's right.
It's the musical, interestingly enough, not the movie, but the musical starts with a kind of frame narrative, which is at a reunion that takes place at the moment the musical comes out of the class, like a 10th reunion of the class featured in Grease, right? So much more than, obviously Grease is kind of a nostalgia piece, but Grease the musical is also already, I mean, this is the very beginning of the 1970s, kind of questioning 50s nostalgia in a certain way. It's both presenting it and also questioning it. And I think much more than the movie, the musical really shows the sort of downsides of this. So that, you know, a character's pregnancy in the musical is much more of a crisis than it ends up being in the musical. I mean, the whole sort of, you know, conclusion of the movie that people who know the movie Grease all know, "You're the one that I want." That's all tacked on. That's new material. And the musical is in certain ways a lot more sort of skeptical about 50s nostalgia, even while it's also sort of presenting 50s nostalgia. And I would say that that's also in American Graffiti too, which is, it's both sort of celebrating the innocence of this time, but there are real ways in which the limitations of this world are also on screen. And I think actually if you when the book comes out and you read the book, I think I came to see a little more of that than I perhaps saw when I wrote my piece for the U.S. Intellectual History blog. More of the sort of, I guess it's a sort of skeptical aspects of American Graffiti towards the time that it represents.
So, is it fair to say they were the Grease and American Graffiti are, as you said, are they questioning whether our memory of the late 50s and early 60s is accurate, or are they mythologizing that era themselves?
They're doing both in a lot of ways. And the 70s is early 70s is very self-conscious about nostalgia as a thing. There's one of the first issues of National Lampoon that comes out, I think, in 1970s is called The Nostalgia Issue, and it's kind of making fun of nostalgia itself.
Wow.
Life magazine does a whole spread on the fabulous 50s, and I think 1971 or 1972, which is talking about, you know, 50s nostalgia. Sha Na Na, which plays Woodstock. People forget Sha Na Na plays Woodstock, right? Is an early example of this, as is Elvis's so-called comeback special in 1969, right? So
where he's dressing like he was back in the 50s, right?
Bingo, yeah. And so I think it's very complicated. I mean, I think that there's both real nostalgia, a certain ironization of that nostalgia. I think in more sophisticated works of 50s nostalgia, there's real critique as well, right? And certainly, like, you know, to take a slightly more obscure film, this is a film that got attention not when it came out, but because a lot of its stars became bigger stars. The Lords of Flatbush, which has a very young Sylvester Stallone and a very young Henry Winkler in it.
Wow.
And after Happy Days hits, we can talk more about Happy Days 2, it gets kind of resold because Henry Winkler's in it and Sly Stallone, who since has made it in Rocky, right? It is it a 2, but it's about these kind of high school gang members in 1950s Brooklyn in Flatbush. And it's largely about kind of the failures of that version of masculinity. I mean, they all kind of, it ends with, I think, one of them having to get married because he's gotten a girl pregnant. And it's clear that their whole way of being in this world is just not going to work, ultimately. And as with any plot like that, there's both a sort of sense of regret and kind of longing for more innocent times, but also a certain kind of critique that this, you know, actually kind of can't work. And I think you see a bit of that in Grease, particularly the musical. You see a bit of that in American Graffiti.
You've kind of alluded to this, but what were some of the pressures on the definition of masculinity in the early 70s? Why were people thinking about different definitions of masculinity? What makes a man in the 70s?
Well, they're always, I mean, one of the jokes in among people who study American history at the graduate level is that one of the facts of American history is masculinity is always in crisis. And to a certain extent, this is true, but the crises change. And I think in the 1970s, there are a number of pressures on masculinity in America. To begin with, the sexual revolution has taken place, which I think most people would say now is very patriarchal. It's not. In many ways, in certain ways, it doesn't directly threaten masculinity, but it transforms masculinity in a lot of ways. America is becoming a more multicultural place, which changes visions of masculinity. The Vietnam War has a very profound effect on this. If war, particularly in the wake of World War II, is, and this goes back obviously long before World War II, but World War II reemphasizes it. If warfare becomes a kind of ultimate expression of masculinity in mid-20th century culture, for much of America, that's no longer the case in the 1970s. And for that reason, among others, it becomes a kind of cultural divide, right? So that there's some people who are still clinging on to that older vision of masculinity. And then there are these newer visions of masculinity. And the clash between the two of them is a constant topic of 1970s culture. So, I mean, I mentioned Dirty Harry, which is sort of about that. The villain in Dirty Harry is this kind of murderous hippie. And Harry Callahan is, suit, tie, 45, but, this sort of thing. But if you think about a song like Okie from Muskogee, I mean, Merle Haggard recently deceased, which is sort of making fun of that cultural divide. It's a song written tongue-in-cheek, but it makes a ton of money. From people who buy into the cultural divide it's making fun of to a very great extent. So I think part of what's going on is not only are there sort of pressures on masculinity, about which there always are, but disagreements about masculinity in 70s America become fault lines for like larger kinds of political issues about war and peace, about the way people dress, hair length. I mean, a lot of these things are sort of continuing on from the 1960s, right? It's interesting that if you look at kind of icons of masculinity in the 1970s, they include people like Fonzie from Happy Days, who's this kind of fantasy figure from the past, which I think is and interestingly enough, is both kind of is the 50s greaser, who's like a rebel from the 1950s, right? So it's both the 50s and a kind of rejection of the 50s, and also a celebration of sort of sexual liberation too, in his own odd way. Because one of the things that makes Fonzie is that girls just kind of fall at his feet, right? And that's in fact largely what Happy Days is about.
Why did Happy Days become such a massive hit in the 1970s as it looked back on sort of an idealized version of the 50s? Is it fair to say?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's an interesting question. Happy Days, and I think the sort of story of Happy Days illuminates a lot of these issues. So Happy Days actually begins life conceptually when, and I'm blanking on his name now, the showrunner who's sort of behind it.
Is it Gary Marshall?
Exactly, Gary Marshall, sorry. Thinks that what TV needs is a show like the sitcoms of the 50s and 60s. So he sees it not just about the 50s, but as being like Leave It to Beaver, like My Three Sons, like those kind of old-fashioned sitcoms as something that could make it in TV. And the first version of it is an episode of Love American Style, which is this anthology show from the 1970s that's pretty popular, set in Milwaukee, as Happy Days is, with some of the characters from Happy Days in it. And that's a couple years before Happy Days makes it to TV. After that, American Graffiti is a big hit. And American Graffiti being a big hit is what puts Happy Days on TV. The success of American Graffiti, which has Ron Howard in it as well, right? Ron Howard's the star of American Graffiti, sells the property of Happy Days, which is kind of languishing as an idea, to the networks. So it gets on the schedule, but it is not a hit at first. And there are really two things that make Happy Days a hit. What actually makes it an enormous hit, oddly enough, is Laverne and Shirley, which comes on after. It's a spin-off show. But Laverne and Shirley is an immediate huge hit, and it lifts Happy Days in the ratings. So, I mean, Happy Days is already popular. That's why it has a spin-off. But it reaches the height of its popularity after Laverne and Shirley shows up, which incidentally co-stars another actor, Shirley Williams, who's in American Graffiti.
Oh, right.
But what makes Happy Days stay on the air long enough for Laverne and Shirley to show up and for Laverne and Shirley to spin off is Fonzie, who's a bit character early on. And over the first couple seasons of the show, becomes absolutely the center of the show. Because he's far and away the most popular character. And he's a character that worries network executives because he's seen as too much of a rebel. One of the stories everybody who knows things about the sort of Happy Days trivia knows is that one of the rules that they put on, they were very suspicious of a guy wearing a leather jacket. And they were very suspicious of a guy with a motorcycle. So they said to the showmakers, look, whatever you do, you can't have him with a leather jacket on the motorcycle. So in the early seasons, when he's on a motorcycle, he's not wearing a leather jacket because they've been told, whatever you do, don't have a leather jacket and a motorcycle together, which I guess shows that there's still a little rebellion left in the tank of that image, right? Which is an old image, right? It's the wild one. It's Marlon Brando in the 1950s. But it's Fonzie who makes that show take off. And the Cunningham family is still, of course, at the center of it. But early on, one of the main characters is Chuck, Richie's older brother, who sort of mysteriously disappears like midway through the first season and is discussed a few times. He's off in college and then like essentially completely disappears after that. And the show largely becomes about Fonzie, who's a more and more important character in it, and sort of creating this very particular image of, I guess you'd say, sort of safe rebellion. And Fonzie gets sort of domesticated over the course of the show, right? He ends up living with the Cunninghams, but he always retains that kind of peculiar kind of cool that Fonzie has. And I think for people who weren't around in the 1970s, it's hard to overstate how cool Fonzie was. I mean, certainly growing up in the 1970s, he was like the very picture of cool. The expressions that he would have, sit on it and things like that, people would use. The idea of, he would hit jukeboxes and jukeboxes would turn on. He'd snap
play whatever song he wants. Yeah.
Girls would show up and so on. Right. But yeah, so Fonzie is key to Happy Days going from being a show that's kind of failing and in danger of being canceled to a show that's a modest hit. And then Laverne and Shirley are key to turning into the sort of like must-watch hour on ABC, and like leads to ABC kind of ruling the roost of network TV in the latter years of the 1970s.
But it all ended with Joni and Chachi. No one wanted Joni and Chachi.
At that point, no.
Well, there's another a major pop cultural touchstone of the 70s that I know your book will explore, and that's the miniseries Roots. Which was was it 1977 that it premiered?
77. It premieres February 1977, early 1977. The book comes out in August 1976.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
So why did Americans of this era make that show such an enormous hit? I mean, that's one of my earliest memories. I actually was watching that show at probably a too young age with my parents, and I feel like everybody in America was watching that show, which is about slavery in the pre-Civil War United States.
And it's hugely popular, and it's a surprise success. The reason it runs, you may know this, on consecutive nights early in 1977. And the reason it runs in consecutive nights over a long week, there are 8 episodes originally, is that the network is afraid it's going to be a huge bomb, and at least they can get it over with in a week.
Oh, wow.
The usual way to have a miniseries, it's coming in the middle of the sort of network TV miniseries, things like Rich Man, Poor Man, most of the other examples of the genre. Holocaust, actually, is another one that comes later. Usually, they would be shown an episode per week over a number of weeks, but ABC is so nervous about Roots that they decide to just dump it in a week. And by the end of the week, it is the most popular show in TV history and stays that way. I mean, at one point, I think 5 of the 8 episodes are 5 of the top 10 most watched shows in television history. It's extraordinary. The only thing that competes with it at the time ironically, is Gone with the Wind when it showed on TV
wow.
in the early 1970s. I don't know if that says something about a fascination with the antebellum South or what. But I think it arrives at a very particular moment. And if you ask me this, even 5-7 years ago, I would have said, this is something people need to really work on because it's so important. But there's been an explosion of interest in roots and in Haley over the last few years. So there's a wonderful book on the making of roots by a historian named Matthew Delmont, I think. And there's a good biography of Haley that's since come out by Robert Norell. And so a lot of stuff has been written by Haley. And the interesting thing about the project is, Haley, whose previous book was the autobiography of Malcolm X, conceives of roots while he's trying to finish the autobiography of Malcolm X in the mid-1960s. And his publisher just wants him to get, Malcolm X has just been assassinated. They want this book out. And so they're like, that's very nice and all, Arthur, but finish the autobiography of Malcolm X. And Haley thinks he's going to write it in like a year or two, and it ends up taking him a decade. And by the time it comes out, America's in the middle of the bicentennial celebrations in 1976, a celebration which the representation of African Americans wasn't particularly prominent, right? So this is a celebration of America's 200th anniversary and what to do about slavery, what to do about that piece of American history is a real problem and often solved by kind of ignoring it, even though there's the federal commission in charge of it has a committee of African-American folks involved in trying to present it. And there's a lot of efforts in the African-American community to represent the Black experience in the bicentennial. So when Roots arrives in the summer of 1976, I think it hits at a time which is very kind of fertile for this. And Roots tells the story of slavery in an extremely, I guess you'd say, positive light. I mean, it's quite harrowing, its depiction, both the TV show and the book, depiction of slavery. But it's all about the Haley family coming through slavery and making a huge success at the other end of it. And it starts with this, I think, pretty intentionally kind of mythicized vision of Africa prior to slavery, right? So that it's more than anything else is it's a particular kind of claim of sort of African Americans on the American experience. The African Americans, like other Americans, come from an old country with significant culture. The difference is that unlike other immigrants who came here voluntarily, African Americans were kidnapped here, right? So that's this vast difference. But what Haley, part of what Roots is doing and part of the power of Roots is that it had been largely thought, and certainly white authors writing about slavery sort of see slavery is this kind of impossible gulf that African Americans can't find their roots on the other side of. And Haley's claim that he can be able to trace his family back all the way back to Africa is extremely culturally powerful. I mean, most immediately for African Americans who see this possibility of reclaiming their connection to their African past. But it's also part of this larger effort in America connected with things like Irving Howe's World of Our Fathers, right? Of Americans, white ethnic Americans, looking back to their European roots. And so it's a very particular kind of claim of inclusion. It's distinct to the African American experience because it's about slavery, but it's also sort of suggesting that like other groups of Americans who came from other parts of the world, African Americans establish themselves here, draw on the cultural strengths of where they're from, can reach back and understand themselves, and in so doing can understand themselves better. So this notion that kind of that understanding not just the experience of slavery, but Africa, which is not, I mean, Haley doesn't invent this, obviously. This is a very powerful part of, Black nationalist thought in the 1960s as well. Malcolm X maybe being the most famous example, though hardly alone. But this is a sort of, if you could put this sort of domestication and popularization of that mode of African-American thought in a way that appealed, as it turned out, not just to Black audiences, did appeal to Black audiences, but to white audiences as well, and managed to open up space for American culture to grapple with slavery, which I think we still haven't done nearly as well as we should. But prior to Roots, we really weren't doing it all. And with Roots, there's at least the beginning of some kind of larger cultural conversation about the legacy of slavery in America.
What a fascinating phenomenon. Well, why is it being revisited in recent scholarship, do you think?
Haley is a kind of problematic figure. And immediately after Roots is published, and in fact, as the TV show is actually in production before the book comes out.
Oh, wow.
And one of the reasons why the TV show differs from the book is the book is kind of being written, it's being finished up as the TV show comes out, is being made, rather. The book's out before the TV show's out. Haley is almost immediately accused by a number of authors of plagiarism. And this results in a sort of series of court cases. And that takes some of the shine off of the achievement of Roots. That is, if particularly the section of Kunta Kinte's life in Africa prior to slavery, he's accused of lifting large pieces of it out of a novel about Africa written by someone else, that sort of takes some of the shine of authenticity off of it. The other thing that happens is people go to Gambia, where Haley had went. Haley traces his family back there, goes there, talks to a griot, a sort of traditional oral historian, who tells him all this information about his family. And a journalist from England goes there shortly after the book comes out and starts asking around and claims that this griot that talks to Haley isn't really a griot, that he basically tells Haley what Haley wanted to hear, that all these things that Haley has claimed. So sort of, in a way, undercutting the central claim for truth that is essential to Roots. Roots, the phenomenon, stays there, but Haley, as a significant African-American author, which he would at first glance seem to absolutely be, gets injured. And already it's a sort of middle-brow book that sometimes isn't taken very seriously. So if you look at Henry Louis Gates' Norton Anthology of African-American Literature, which comes out, I think, in the late 80s, early 90s, Haley isn't in it. It's this big, huge book. Haley's not there. And Gates, right, has a TV show on PBS called Finding Your Roots, which wouldn't exist if not for Alex Haley. Huh. Right? And so Alex Haley is in that sense I think call him Arthur Haley. I don't know why I did that. Alex Haley is a problematic figure for that reason, both because of these accusations of plagiarism and making up a book that sells itself as a nonfiction novel. That's the term that it's marketed under and that he insists on. And because it's sort of not highbrow literature. And for decades, I think that made people sort of, scholars, ease away from looking at it and taking it very seriously, even as the legacy of Roots remains incredibly powerful in American culture, particularly in African-American culture. People have written about like even invocations of Kunta Kinte's name, right? In hip hop, in other culture, there's a way in which this story becomes one of the kind of foundational American stories after Roots comes out. It's not surprising. It's a huge bestseller. It's one of the most popular TV shows of all time. And so I think what's happened is Haley himself dies, I think, the late 80s, maybe early 90s. Never writes another really major book. Over time, some of that controversy dies down. The sense of its cultural significance remains. Roots gets remade, as a mini series last decade as well. I think that had something to do with it. And anniversaries make a difference, right? So I think when we got to the 40th anniversary of Roots, 40th, am I right about this? Yeah, last decade. That ends up being a moment where people are suddenly sort of turning back to this. And this is also part of the larger phenomenon that we've already talked about a bit of the 1970s becoming much more central in people's thinking about the American past. So once the 70s become really important, arguably the single most popular television show of the 1970s, and a television show that stands out in a decade without a lot of representation of African Americans on TV. There's some, of course, Good Times, other Sanford and Son. It's not alone, but it's unusual. It's looking at slavery. all of a sudden I think seemed just too important not to talk about it anymore. And people have started taking it seriously. And I think Haley deserves to be taken seriously. Despite all of that, it's not that there isn't any ground to that criticism. There's some real criticism there. But this is a transformational piece of popular culture. American culture after Roots wouldn't be what it was if not for Roots. And I think it's almost irresponsible for scholars not to pay attention to it and what it ends up meaning at the time and in the decades since.
You mentioned another major episode of the 1970s, looking back at the American past, the bicentennial, which seems like, in my memory of it, it seems like a completely uncomplicated, let's look back at the glorious founding of the United States. I take it that your book takes a different approach to what was going on with America's celebration of its bicentennial.
A slightly different approach. Yeah, I mean, what's going on with American celebration of its bicentennial is, this is an anniversary. Unlike Roots, which is kind of unexpected, the bicentennial is very expected, right? Everyone knows it's coming up in 1976. So President Johnson actually starts laying the groundwork for the celebration of the bicentennial at the end of his presidency. This is in the wake of the sesquicentennial of the Civil War, which takes place earlier in the 1960s, and is something of a disaster because it's still dominated by that celebration is dominated by sort of neo-Confederate accounts of the war at a moment where it's the middle of the civil rights movement and there's a lot of pushback against that. So there's a sense that the bicentennial has to be handled with great care. We're going to plan it well in advance. So Johnson lays the groundwork for it. Nixon comes in, almost immediately sees it as a political opportunity. Reworks it as a political opportunity, and then gets criticized for that because it's seen as kind of corrupt and a special pleading in a lot of ways. And the whole thing in the early 1970s has developed a very bad reputation for itself, even before America goes through these extremely difficult years. Watergate, after all, is just before the bicentennial, right? There's one of the most interesting kind of instances in American culture of the left asserting itself, and the far left asserting itself in the early 1970s, is this effort called the People's Bicentennial Commission, which is this attempt in the early 70s to try to create this counter narrative to what the American Revolutionary Bicentennial Commission, later the American Revolutionary Bicentennial Administration, which is the official federal effort, is trying to set up. And they set up the People's Bicentennial Commission is trying to create this more radical image of what the American Revolution is about, and they engage in a lot of the sort of street theater that the sort of post-Yippie left is very good at, to sort of capture a lot of public imagination actually about this. What ends up happening is the Ford administration comes in, and in the wake of all the criticism of Nixon's handling of the plans for the bicentennial and of the collapse of the Nixon administration, they come up with a sort of reduced vision. In the early days, the idea was there was going to be something like the centennial. There's a huge World's Fair in Philadelphia in 1876. And the early plans are to do something like that in some American city, some big centralized national celebration. But by the time all the criticism has been lodged at federal efforts in the early 70s, John Warner, who later becomes a senator from Virginia, gets put in charge of it. And he decides to sort of cut it back in a lot of ways and to make it largely an effort where the federal government is going to sort of certify local efforts. It's going to be very decentralized. Those efforts are going to be recognized with, maybe you remember it. The one thing they do very well is they come up with a very distinctive logo, this kind of negative space star logo.
I remember seeing it on cups and T-shirts through the
it's
entire
all over the place.
70s. Yeah,
and so that's what they do. They license things, right? People apply and they get licenses for these things, so it gets kind of an official stamp of approval. And by the time the bicentennial actually comes around, and Rick Perlstein, who's a historian who's written a lot about the 1970s, writes about this in his book Invisible Bridge, which is about the late 1970s. To everyone's surprise, in the summer of 1976, this ends up being a huge success. And there's like this kind of sense of patriotism and so on, despite kind of all the mess along the way. But what I write about in my chapter is something that doesn't happen, which I think is part of this whole story, which is that amidst all of these failures and successes, what doesn't emerge is a really sort of consensual narrative about what the American Revolution is about, which reflects the kind of fragmentation in a lot of ways of American culture and politics in the mid-1970s. So, I mean, it's easy to celebrate images of the revolution in a lot of ways. It's harder to tell a kind of coherent narrative about what this event was. And there are different versions of that. But in a way, they're also politicized by the middle of the 1970s, that there can't be something that the entire nation can sort of get behind. Everyone can get behind the idea of the revolution, but what does the revolution mean, right? Is it the right thinks it's about capitalism and free enterprise and things like that? The left thinks it's about small d democracy and overthrowing tyranny and so on. That's in a way a disagreement that's never really resolved by the bicentennial celebrations at all. Instead, what you get is what the new left historian Jesse Lemisch called bicentennial kitsch, right? Where it's like endless bottles of wild turkey in the form of presidential heads and so on, right? That you have, but what you don't have is a coherent narrative about what the American Revolution was about. And that absence is kind of what I read about. And actually, one of the things I talk a lot about in that chapter is a movie that came out the year before, but that's set in 1976, which is Robert Altman's Nashville, which is a movie, even though it's in 75, it takes place in the bicentennial. And on the one hand, all the sort of patriotic signifiers in that movie are sort of made fun of for their emptiness. But there's also a sort of nostalgic quality to all of it. That the film, I mean, depending on how you can see this can be a criticism of the film or something in its favor. The film very much tries to have it both ways. It both wants to be sort of knowing and critical of sort of empty patriotism, but it also sort of sees the power of patriotism and doesn't entirely want to leave that behind. And yet, what does it all ultimately mean? Sort of in Nashville, it kind of means, we'll survive somehow, which is sort of bookended. If you know the film, it starts with this recording of this kind of fake patriotic anthem, which is all about America being about surviving crises. And it ends, again, sorry to spoil a film from 1975, but it ends with the presidential candidate who's at the sort of center of the film being the target of an assassination attempt that ends up killing another character. And a character who's been sort of lurking in the background of the film, taking up the microphone on stage at this rally and singing the song, which has been sung by a variety of different characters throughout it, the lyrics of which are, "It Don't Worry Me." So it's sort of transcending tragedy and violence with this kind of almost like nihilism is putting it the wrong way, but it's sort of just, saying, we'll move beyond it. And maybe if we all do that together, we'll survive.
That feels like a very 70s vibe.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know if that answers your question, but...
Yeah. Well, another aspect of 70s pop culture that looked back at the past in interesting ways was music. I've been reading a blog during the pandemic where I've been unable to concentrate on book-length things. So I've been reading a blog with entries covering every number one hit song of the entire Billboard era. So the writer started in 1958, and recently he's worked his way through the 70s, and he noticed an interesting phenomenon of 70s music that 70s artists covered 60s songs constantly and had huge hits with them.
Yep.
Does this sort of fit into your idea of what's happening in the 70s? This looking back at the not distant past at all, as if there's a major chasm separating itself? Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, when you think about it, you were the first sort of generation of rock and rollers entering their middle age in the 1970s, in a sense. And this is, music critics, Ellen Willis, I think, writes about this in the 1970s, who's one of the major rock critics and one of the very few female rock critics in the 1970s, about the sort of way in which rock and roll has lost its kind of sense of rebellion that it had back in the day. So yeah, absolutely. There's the reworkings of old music. There are, old stars like Frankie Valli having hits, which are, a song like Garden Party is sort of about that. When we think about Garden Party, think about American Pie. Think about all these songs, right, from the 70s that are not only, that are kind of about the musical past in a way. And I would say that a lot of what's going on in the early punk scene is like that too. So the word punk for punk rock is usually attributed to the zine called Punk, which comes out of Lower Manhattan in the 1970s, and celebrates what we now think of as the punk scene, the Ramones and so on. The first issue of Punk has a whole article in there about Marlon Brando as a figure of cool in the 50s Marlon Brando, right? Not 70s Marlon Brando. Right? And it's very much about rejecting hippie and rejecting the 60s, right? So a lot of the punk scene is very self-consciously distinguishing itself from that image of culture. And the 50s, for some people in that scene, ended up being a kind of interesting touchstone. And I think the fact that Brando shows up in the very first as a topic in the very first image of very first issue of Punk is kind of indicative of that. And as I said, and ways in which the 50s don't just mean later on in the 80s, the 50s come to sort of stand for like the conservative past versus the 60s, which are kind of like the liberal past. That's a kind of post-Reagan formulation. There's some of that in the 70s, but there are also people who are still looking to the 50s as a sort of, I guess you'd say, more authentic kind of rebellion than the 60s. That like there's a sense in which people see the 60s as somehow inauthentic in a way that 50s rebellion wasn't, and some of that is haunting the punk scene. You see that. You see a bit of that actually in the early music of someone like Jonathan Richman, right? Who, songs like "I'm Straight," right, where he's singing about how he doesn't use drugs and how unlike this like other guy who's his rival named Hippie Johnny, right? So there's this kind of embracing this kind of other issue, this kind of image of being countercultural in a way which is 60s countercultural. And that ends up being, I think, a very important part of the way punk presents itself in this country. And it's very much backward looking in a certain ways. And music critics who don't like punk, that's what they say. They say this is, you read more hostile reviews of early Blondie albums or early Ramones albums. They're like, this is warmed over rock and roll.
We've gotten past this.
We've gotten past this. Yeah, what's the big deal?
Yeah.
But it's a rejection, not just of the 60s, of course, but also things like art rock and things like that sort of come out of the 60s, where it's ever more sort of, I guess the punk scene would say, sort of pretentious in certain ways.
We're living in such an interesting time in history now, living under the pandemic conditions. And I'm wondering, just to kind of wrap up, do you think there are some aspects of the way we are now currently looking back at our recent past that tell us where we are right now as a society? I'm thinking about like the huge amount of interest in the Michael Jordan Last Dance documentary. Like let's all look back at the 90s, and it is such an odd time in history. Like I find myself going back to watching comfortable TV shows like Cheers from the 80s because I don't want to be challenged by anything particularly right now. What is the status of American memory in 2020 right now?
I sometimes say that one of the reasons I'm a historian is I don't want to be responsible for the present and the future.
That's fair.
And in fact, part of the story of the 70s, right, is the story of a decade that at the time and for a couple decades afterwards wasn't seen as being a very important decade. It is now seen as absolutely crucial. So I think that, this moment will come into better focus 20 years from now than it is now. I think what you're suggesting, which is that the bits of the past that we look to, whether now or in the 1970s, tell us a lot about ourselves, is absolutely true. And the kinds of what aspects of the American past people look back on and think about, either in contrast to where they are, or as hope for where they want to go, or in the most straightforward way, similar to where they are today, tells you a lot about the moment that we're in now. I mean, we talked at the first episode of Brainbox, as you said, about Watergate, and I think that particularly through our most recent impeachment drama, Watergate was a moment that a lot of people were looking back to, for good reason, as a sort of interesting comparison, touchstone to sort of where America is today. The pandemic has kind of reworked all of this, right? I mean, people are now thinking about the 1917 flu epidemic, 1919 flu epidemic, which is an event which we don't think about a lot otherwise. And which actually, the interesting thing is, and historians have written about this already, people didn't have that much of an impact on American culture at the time, even though it killed hundreds of thousands of people, right? It's fascinating that it had a huge demographic impact. But in fact, if you look at American literature, if you look at American music, if you look at things like that from 1919, people just going about their lives. So like that's not going to be the case with this pandemic, I can tell you. I think this is going to have a tremendous impact on the way in which Americans think about and talk about themselves. What that impact is, I'm not sure. So keep your eye on this space. Maybe if you're still doing Brainbox, and if I'm still around, you're still doing Brainbox in 2030 or 2040, we can have a conversation about 2020.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Ben. We really appreciate you being here now in 2020. I really have enjoyed talking with you about this topic. And
my pleasure.
You can check out our website at okhumanities.org/brainbox for additional information about some of the topics we discussed in this episode. We encourage you to comment about what you've heard on the Brainbox podcast. You can leave comments through the Podbean app and the okhumanities.org/brainbox website, and on social media by using #BrainboxOK. Please give us a rating, and you can also email comments and ideas for future episodes to us at brainbox@okhumanities.org. Thank you to Blacken Studios. You can find out more about Blacken Studios at blackenstudio.com and on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Our theme music was composed by Jeff Moreva, and this program is funded by Oklahoma Humanities. Any views expressed in the podcast do not necessarily represent those of Oklahoma Humanities. This has been Brainbox, a podcast for your noggin.